Imagine opening your eyes to the sound of the earth itself groaning, a low, deep rumble that seems to rise from the depths of the planet. At first you think it's a storm, maybe the wind clawing at the trees or the tide hammering the shore, but then you feel it. The ground under you isn't still. It rolls beneath your body in long, heaving swells, just like the ocean, but you're nowhere near a boat. The air smells sharp with salt spray, even though the tide is far away, and every muscle in your body tells you something is terribly wrong. Outside, the world is in motion. Towering spruces sway violently, their roots groaning in the soil. Small stones tumble from the hillsides in a constant rattling rain. Somewhere, deep inside the valleys carved by ancient ice, there's a thunderous crack, as if a mountain has just been split open. Across the bay, enormous white cliffs of ice, the faces of mighty glaciers, are collapsing in monstrous avalanches, sending geysers of seawater and shattered ice hundreds of feet into the air. And then, the sea itself begins to rise. Not in the slow, predictable rhythm of the tide, but in a surging wall, a heaving curve of water 20, 30 feet high, rushing toward the shore like some furious living thing. It crashes into the beaches, tears through the driftwood line, and slams into the forest, ripping trees from their roots and sweeping them away like matchsticks. If you could stand above it all, looking down, you'd see something even stranger, a transformation that defies belief. Entire stretches of coastline are lifting. Beaches that had been touched by every tide for centuries are suddenly high and dry, standing dozens of feet above the reach of the water. Rock ledges that had always been submerged now bristle with barnacles and mussels, their shells drying in the sun. In minutes, the very shape of the land is changing, as if some giant hand has seized Alaska's edge and heaved it upward toward the sky. What if I told you this wasn't a scene from a movie, not some fantasy dreamed up for the big screen, but a real event, recorded in living memory? What if I told you that in September of 1899, in one of the most remote and beautiful corners of North America, the earth didn't just shake, it rose, violently, reshaping everything in its path. This was no ordinary earthquake. The people who lived it, tough prospectors, native hunters, and a handful of scientists, described it as if the land had come alive. Some saw lakes burst from their beds and roar down to the sea. Others watched as giant glaciers surged forward, their ice breaking into 1,000 splintered chasms. In some places, the ground climbed skyward by more than 47 feet in an instant, higher than a 4-story building. In others, the sea rushed in to claim forests and beaches, drowning them forever. It was an event so massive that the shockwaves traveled around the globe, shaking seismographs in London, Cape Town, and Tokyo. And yet, despite its power, its human toll was almost non-existent. No cities destroyed, no thousands dead. Because of that, the Yakutat Bay earthquakes faded from public memory, buried in the pages of old geological surveys and the yellowed accounts of men long gone. But to the earth, the scars remain. The cliffs are still higher than they were. The islands born that day still stand. And the glaciers, some retreating, some forever altered by those moments, still carry the memory of that upheaval in their fractured ice. So the question is, what really happened in Yakutat Bay in the autumn of 1899? How could one event not only shake the ground but lift it, twisting the landscape into a new shape in a matter of minutes? And if it could happen there, in a forgotten corner of Alaska, could it happen again, somewhere far less remote? Far out on the ragged edge of Alaska's southern coast, between the restless waters of the Gulf of Alaska and the frozen summits of the St. Elias Range, lies a place few people in 1899 had ever heard of: Yakutat Bay. It was a deep, cold inlet carved by ancient ice, its waters a shifting mirror of gray and green, its shores a puzzle of rocky islands, sandy spits, and sheer mountain walls. From the deck of a ship approaching from the south, the bay looked almost like a wound in the coastline, a great V-shaped cut in an otherwise unbroken stretch of shoreline that runs for hundreds of miles. The bay was no ordinary coastal indentation. It pierced straight into the Yakutat foreland, a low, glacially built plain that lay like a ramp between the sea and the jagged peaks beyond. This foreland was young in geologic terms, made of gravel, sand, and clay dumped by mighty glaciers that had once filled the bay entirely. Even in 1899, glaciers were everywhere. To the north loomed the Hubbard Glacier, an immense wall of ice 4 to 5 miles across at its face, feeding icebergs into the bay with cannon-like booms. To the northwest sprawled the Malaspina Glacier, a gigantic ice plateau tens of miles wide, so vast that it seemed more like frozen land than a glacier at all. And beyond all that, lifting their heads above the clouds, were the St. Elias Mountains. Mount St. Elias itself soared to 18,000 feet, second only to Denali in height, its flanks buried in permanent snow. Mount Logan, even higher, lay just over the border in Canada. These were not old, worn-down mountains. They were young by geological standards, still growing, still shouldering their way upward, still trembling from the forces that had thrust them into the sky. The ranges here were a meeting place of titanic forces, where the crust of the earth buckled and broke under unimaginable pressure. The landscape bore all the signs of youth: sharp ridges, unstable slopes, and glaciers pouring down every valley. For people, it was a hard place to live. The village of Yakutat huddled near the southeast entrance to the bay, a small community of native Tlingit families, a few traders, and missionaries. In summer, the days were long and cool. In winter, storms swept in from the Pacific, lashing the coast with rain, snow, and wind. The sea provided salmon, halibut, and seals, while the forests offered berries, game, and timber. But the bay was isolated. There were no roads, no telegraph, no easy way in or out. The only connection to the outside world was by boat, and that meant relying on fair weather and luck. That year, 1899, a handful of outsiders had come to try their fortunes in the gold rush era's fading glow. News had spread of gold, and even platinum in the gravels near the glaciers, and so small groups of prospectors worked the stony beaches and moraine streams. They lived in rough tents or cabins, enduring the damp chill, watching the glaciers from a respectful distance. Some had set up camp on the moraines near Hubbard Glacier itself, hammering at the stubborn earth for flakes of gold, completely unaware of the changes the land was preparing to unleash. Life was slow, predictable in its own rough way. The tides rose and fell, the glaciers creaked and groaned in the distance, and storms came and went. But there were subtle hints that this was no truly stable land. Along the shores, sharp-eyed observers might notice something odd: barnacles clinging to rock ledges well above the reach of the highest tides, as if the sea had once been higher, or the land lower. On certain beaches, lines of driftwood lay stranded far above the water, their arrangement too precise to be the work of random waves. In the forest, there were places where saltwater plants and land plants grew almost side by side, a strange mingling of worlds that suggested the shoreline had shifted, not just in centuries past, but perhaps more recently. The glaciers themselves seemed restless. Muir Glacier, far to the southeast, had been retreating more rapidly than usual, its ice face pulling back from the sea. Elsewhere, smaller ice tongues advanced unexpectedly, pushing into the forests and crushing trees under fresh blue ice. None of it made headlines. Alaska was still a vast mystery to most Americans, but for those who lived in Yakutat Bay, these changes were a quiet reminder that the land and ice here were never still. At night, the mountains sometimes gave off distant rumbles, not the sharp crack of an avalanche, but a deeper, more resonant growl. Locals shrugged it off, chalking it up to ice falls or shifting glaciers. Still, the bay had an undercurrent of tension, the way the air feels heavy before a thunderstorm. It was the kind of place where you learn not to take the ground for granted. And in the final days of August and the first days of September, as clouds gathered over the St. Elias peaks and the summer of 1899 began to fade, the stage was quietly set for a drama unlike anything the bay had ever seen, an upheaval that would shatter the shoreline, rearrange the glaciers, and echo in the memory of the earth itself. On the morning of September 3rd, 1899, Yakutat Bay woke to a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't the sharp boom of a calving glacier, which the locals knew well, nor the rumble of an approaching storm. This was deeper, so deep it seemed to roll up from the core of the earth itself, vibrating through the soles of their boots and the bones in their chests. The air carried no wind, yet the very ground beneath them began to shudder. At first it was subtle, a faint trembling like the first stirrings of a restless sleeper. Prospectors working their gravel pans along the streams near Hubbard Glacier stopped mid-swipe, looking up in confusion. One of them later said it was like the earth was breathing underfoot, a strange up-and-down motion that made the knees feel weak. Then it came harder, a long, swinging sway that set the tall spruce and hemlock trees into motion. Branches whipped back and forth, shaking loose showers of needles. The sound grew as the motion intensified. Rocks clicked and clattered down nearby slopes. From somewhere deep in the mountains came a drawn-out crack, like an enormous tree splitting, except no tree could make a sound so immense. On the glacier, great slabs of ice fractured and fell, booming as they hit the bay. A prospector named Flenner later recalled gripping a tent pole just to stay upright, watching in disbelief as the moraine beneath his feet heaved like the deck of a ship in rough seas. The shaking lasted less than a minute, but when it ended, the bay felt different, quieter, but also strangely charged, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Men came out of their tents to trade uneasy glances. Those who had been through minor Alaska quakes before muttered that this one was something else entirely. In the days that followed, other oddities began to emerge. Out along the rocky points of the bay, men noticed barnacles and mussels clinging to ledges they swore had always been just under the waterline, now sitting high and dry, inches or even feet above the reach of the tide. Some were still alive, their shells shut tight against the air. Others had already begun to whiten and crack in the sun. It didn't take long for talk to start. In the village of Yakutat, elders remembered times when the shoreline had shifted suddenly, when beaches had appeared where there had been none and forests had drowned overnight. Some said the land here was young, still finding its shape, and that such movements were part of its nature. But this felt different. The barnacles weren't the only clue. In certain coves, strands of seaweed lay tangled far above the highest tide mark. On sandy spits, lines of driftwood sat at odd angles, as though placed there by waves that could only have come from a massive sea surge. Among the prospectors, the speculation turned more anxious. They had come to Yakutat Bay chasing rumors of gold and platinum in the glacier gravels, not to be caught in some unpredictable convulsion of nature. But the truth was, none of them really knew what the bay was capable of. The mountains here were so high they seemed to make their own weather. The glaciers were so vast they could swallow a man without trace. And now the ground itself had given them a taste of its strength. As the days ticked by after the September 3rd shock, the air over the bay seemed heavier. A faint haze sometimes hung between the peaks, blurring their outlines. At night, there were sounds, low, distant thumps and groans, that could have been avalanches, or could have been something deeper. On calm evenings, the waters of Disenchantment Bay sometimes pulsed with faint ripples that had no wind to drive them. The locals shrugged and carried on, but there was an undercurrent of watchfulness, a sense that the land was restless. A few of the prospectors began keeping crude logs of what they saw and felt. One entry, later recovered, noted, "Barnacles high on rock, never saw before. Fish moving strange in shallows. Ground uneasy underfoot at times." Another simply read, "The big one hasn't come yet." No one knew how prophetic that last line would turn out to be. The September 3rd quake had been strong enough to rattle nerves and stir old memories, but it was only a prelude. Beneath the mountains and glaciers, forces far older and more powerful than any man were still building. The crust here was under strain, the kind of slow, silent pressure that can hold for decades before letting go in a single violent instant. And in Yakutat Bay, that instant was drawing near. The morning of September 10th, 1899, began in a way that put every nerve on edge. The sun was barely over the jagged rim of the St. Elias Range when the first tremor struck, not the faint, testing quivers of an unsettled earth, but jolts strong enough to make the ground twitch beneath your boots. In the prospector camps near the moraine of Hubbard Glacier, men woke to the sound of pots and pans clattering against each other, tent poles rattling in their sockets. One camp, pitched on an alluvial fan close to the glacier's southeastern edge, was occupied by Captain Smith, the Cox brothers, and a few others. Across a glacial stream, the rest of the party, Flanner, Fultz, Bullman, Johnson, and Stevens, worked their claims on gravel bars. They had been on edge since the September 3rd shock, but nothing could have prepared them for the drumbeat that began shortly after dawn that Sunday. By 9 in the morning, the shaking was so frequent that conversation was a stop-and-start affair, interrupted by the rattling of gear and the shivering of the ground. At 9 a.m., a particularly strong tremor hit, hard enough to throw a man off balance. The low alderbrush shook and bent like reeds in a gale, L.A. Cox later wrote. The men decided to keep track of the jolts, fashioning a crude seismograph from hunting knives. They balanced the blades so their tips touched lightly. Even the slightest tremor would cause them to jingle. By the time the sun climbed toward its zenith, they had counted more than 50 shocks. At 1:50 p.m., the Earth decided to stop holding back. The first seconds were familiar, the long, rolling motion they'd felt a week earlier. But this time the swaying grew, then changed. The ground didn't just swing from side to side. It began to rise and fall beneath them in great, nauseating undulations. It was waving up and down like the swells of the sea, only with considerably more energy, Cox wrote. Men staggered, grabbing for tent poles or dropping to their knees to keep from being pitched onto the gravel. One of the Cox brothers was thrown headlong over their camp stove. Flanner remembered the queerest capers imaginable in the motion of the earth. Up on the slope behind the camps, a small lake had formed over years of meltwater pooling in the moraine. The quake shattered its boundaries in an instant. The water roared down in a churning brown wall, sweeping boulders the size of barrels. This lake broke from its bed and dashed down upon our camp, Fultz recalled. Men scattered along the shoreline, sprinting to higher ground. The flood smashed into tents, tore apart cooking gear, and buried what it couldn't carry away under tons of rock. Before they could catch their breath, a new sound rose from the bay, deeper, more terrible than the lake's roar. It was a grinding, booming note, accompanied by a white flash along the face of Hubbard Glacier. The monster quake had ripped loose vast slabs of ice, and they were hitting the water with the force of falling buildings. From the chaos surged a wave, 20 to 30 feet high, racing outward in all directions. We saw a tidal wave coming toward us, preceded by great geysers shooting into the air, some several feet across and 30 or 40 feet high, Cox wrote. The wave struck the already flooded shoreline with a violence that defies easy description. The combined surge of lake water and sea smashed through the morainic hills, ripping out willows and alders by their roots. In some places, the wall of water swept entirely over the low ridges, scouring them down to bare gravel. In others, it left a mess of splintered wood, glacial ice chunks, and dead fish tangled in heaps. The air stank of mud, crushed plants, and the faint, bitter tang of broken sea life. And then, almost as quickly as it had begun, the waters withdrew. What they left behind was nothing short of astonishing. In minutes, Yakutat Bay's shoreline had been rewritten. Reefs and rock benches that had always been just beneath the surface now jutted high into the air, their barnacle-encrusted faces dripping. In certain spots, the uplift was staggering, over 47 feet, higher than a 4-story building. Whole stretches of coast that had once been washed by every tide now stood far above the reach of the water. One prospector, stumbling over a new beach littered with dying mussels, described the scene as the sea dropped away from us and left the bottom showing. It wasn't the sea dropping, though. It was the land rising, wrenched upward by the titanic forces of the quake. Entire points of land had been reborn. New islands rose where there had been only waves before. The old tide lines, with their fringe of seaweed, were now a distant mark below the new shore. In the chaos, survival was still the only priority. The Flanner Fultz party's boats were destroyed, smashed to splinters by the floods. The Smithcock's camp, though damaged, still had one small boat miraculously spared, found tangled in alder branches above the floodline, its painter rope wound tight by the current. The two groups reunited on higher ground for the night, wet, hungry, and surrounded by the constant aftershocks that rattled the hills. Imagine the continual reports of ice breaking off the glacier, the roar of great landslides, the noise of swollen streams, tumbling boulders, continuous rain, an occasional earthquake, and the uncertainty of what was to come next, Cox wrote. They had no fire, no shelter, and little food. Most of what had been in their tents was either washed away or buried in mud. They tore up scraps of clothing to lash themselves to small alder trees, fearing another great wave in the dark. Each aftershock sent a ripple through the ground, and somewhere, another mass of ice or rock would break loose, adding its voice to the night's endless rumble. In the daylight that followed, the scale of what had happened became clearer. Along Disenchantment Bay and Russell Fjord, the uplift varied, but in places it was measured in dozens of feet. The air above the new shores was alive with the smell of exposed marine life, barnacles, mussels, and bryozoans drying in the sun. The fjord walls showed fresh scars where rock had sheared away. Streams, once meeting the sea at the old tide line, now tumbled over new cliffs to reach the water. For the men who lived it, there was no scientific detachment, no thought of vertical tectonic displacement or crustal deformation. There was only the raw astonishment of having seen the world change in front of them, land rising where there had been sea, mountains seeming to push higher in the space of minutes. And for the scientists who had come later, this day would stand as one of the most remarkable records of sudden uplift in modern history, an event that not only shook the earth but lifted it, sculpting a new Alaska while the witnesses clung to the trembling ground. The quake had passed, but the danger hadn't. In the stunned silence after the noon convulsion, the men stood on a shore they barely recognized, surrounded by wreckage. The little security they'd had, a camp, a tent, a boat, was gone or ruined. The landscape was unfamiliar, as if some giant hand had torn up the map they'd been living on and sketched a new one in jagged lines. The first challenge was simple: surviving the night. Rain fell in sheets, drumming on the alder thickets and soaking through the men's clothes. Their tents had been ripped away by the lake flood or shredded by the tsunami's debris. What little food they had, flour, beans, dried meat, was buried in silt or carried into the bay. They had no fire to warm themselves, no dry blankets, no shelter beyond what they could scrape together from driftwood and branches. The survivors lashed themselves to the thicker alder trunks, fearing another great wave might come while they slept. The uncertainty of what was to come next was the worst, Cox would later recall. Every aftershock jolted them awake, and the night was never quiet. There was always some new sound of destruction, the thunder of icebergs calving into the bay, the dull roar of rock slides somewhere in the mountains, the hiss and rattle of swollen streams tumbling boulders toward the sea. When morning came, the scene was even stranger in daylight. Along the new shoreline lay the wreckage of the ocean floor. Rocks once hidden under fathoms of water now sat bleaching in the air, covered with limp barnacles and drying seaweed. Dead fish lay everywhere. Some were tossed high into the alder brush by the waves, their silver scales dulled and eyes clouded. Others littered the fresh gravel, gasping in shallow pools left behind by the retreating water. With their food supplies gone, the men turned to these quake-killed fish, roasting what they could find on hastily built stick frames over tiny fires coaxed from damp wood. The idea of simply leaving wasn't as simple as it sounded. To the north and west, walls of ice blocked every possible route. Hubbard Glacier's face was now a shattered chaos, spilling bergs into the water in unpredictable avalanches. To the east, the land was too rugged, with cliffs freshly fractured by the quake and still crumbling in aftershocks. The only real hope was to get to the village of Yakutat, far to the southeast, and that meant traveling by water. The Smithcock's party's small boat, miraculously spared when the floodwaters caught it in the alder branches, became their lifeline. But it was too small to carry everyone. The Flunner-Foltz group's craft had been completely destroyed, smashed to pieces, and scattered among the drift. For a day, they scoured the rack line for anything that could be turned into repairs: fragments of planks, bent nails, bits of rope. Their hands were raw from the cold and the wet, but they managed to lash together enough salvaged timber to patch a second canoe into something barely seaworthy. The journey itself was an exercise in nerve. The bay, still unsettled from the quake, was treacherous. Great chunks of ice drifted everywhere, some small enough to push aside with an oar, others the size of cabins, rolling dangerously in the swell. Each aftershock brought the risk of another icefall, and they learned to listen for the deep cracks that signaled a calving event, ready to turn the boats toward the nearest lee shore if a wave formed. Worse still was the weather. The storms that sweep the Gulf of Alaska don't wait for human schedules, and rain squalls barreled across the bay without warning. Wind-driven spray stung their faces, and the boats rode low under the combined weight of men, gear, and the precious few supplies they'd managed to save. Any shift in balance could swamp them. At night, they made camp where they could, sometimes on strips of beach littered with dead kelp, sometimes in a shelter of driftwood piles. Fires were small and smoky, and they kept one man on watch at all times in case the tide or a drifting berg threatened the camp. They still relied heavily on the fish they could collect, supplemented with the occasional seabird caught with a thrown stone. Days passed in this way, the shoreline sliding by in a strange mixture of old familiarity and shocking change. Places the men thought they knew were now altered beyond recognition. Beaches they had walked before the quake were gone, replaced by steep scarps or lifted high above the reach of the tide. New reefs jutted into the bay, some so fresh they still dripped with the last clinging life from their time underwater. When at last they reached the lower end of the bay and the approach to Yakutat village, they were gaunt from cold and hunger, their clothes torn and stiff with salt. The Tlingit community there welcomed them with what help they could offer: dry space, food, and the warmth of a fire. In their eyes, the quake was not entirely unexpected. The land in this part of Alaska was alive, and it had always been capable of sudden, violent change. But for the prospectors, hardened though they were, the journey had been a reminder of just how quickly survival could come down to luck, a bit of skill, and the ability to keep moving when the world itself was falling apart. When the first scientific teams arrived in Yakutat Bay months after the September 1899 earthquakes, they found a coastline that looked like it had been rewritten in haste. For the geologists, this was a once-in-a-lifetime laboratory, an entire section of the Earth's surface freshly altered, the evidence still raw and unmistakable. The weathered patience of normal geology, where change is measured in centuries, had been replaced here by something sudden, violent, and frozen in place for anyone to read. Mapping began at the shorelines. The first thing they noted was the new height of the beaches. In places, sea cliffs that had been gnawed at by waves for untold years now stood far above the water, dry and stark in the sun. The old, high tide mark could be traced by a dark band of seaweed still clinging to rock, and above it, stranded higher still, were the barnacle zones, bands of marine creatures that could only survive submerged, now marooned yards above the surf. In certain spots near Disenchantment Bay, scientists measured an astonishing 47 feet of uplift. This was not a slow geological swelling. It had happened in minutes, during the height of the quake. The evidence was everywhere. Along rocky points, mussels lay bleached and brittle, still in the positions they'd grown when waves washed over them daily. In shallow inlets, the exposed seafloor stretched far out from the old shore, dotted with starfish and limpets that would never reach the water again. Even the flow of freshwater streams had been disrupted. Many now tumbled over new drop-offs, forming waterfalls where before they'd met the tide directly. As the scientists moved inland, they began tracing the lines of faulting that had caused such massive shifts. These weren't the long, neat fractures of textbook diagrams, but jagged, twisting dislocations. The crust here had moved in blocks, some shoved upward, others dropped slightly, all in the blink of an eye. Unlike the earthquakes in California, which were dominated by lateral slip along faults like the San Andreas, the Yakutat Bay event had been primarily vertical. The land didn't just shake, It heaved upward, as though the mountains themselves had been shoved from below. The aftereffects were not limited to the land. One of the most extraordinary findings came from the glaciers. The quake had acted on them like a sudden shove to a loaded spring. Near Glacier, far to the southeast but within the quake's reach, began to retreat rapidly in the years that followed, pulling back miles from its old position. Whether the quake fractured its bed, altered subglacial drainage, or simply jolted its already thinning ice into accelerated collapse, the timing was undeniable. The retreat was sharper and swifter than before. Closer to Yakutat Bay, other glaciers reacted in the opposite way. The Malaspina Glacier, a sprawling plateau of ice more than 40 miles across, showed clear evidence of a sudden advance in one of its lobes. This surge pushed forward over its own foreland, crushing forest in its path and leaving piles of broken trees embedded in the ice margin. Smaller ice tongues in the region did the same, their surfaces cracking into fresh crevasses and pushing ridges of moraine ahead of them. For the scientists, these glacier movements were a revelation. Glaciers are slow creatures by nature, moving in inches and feet per day at most, yet here was proof that a seismic shock could jolt them into sudden action. It was the kind of connection between Earth processes, tectonics, and glaciology that had rarely been documented in real time. The pattern of uplift also told its own story. The greatest vertical movement was measured near Disenchantment Bay, tapering off to the south and east. This suggested a block of crust beneath the St. Elias Range had been abruptly tilted, one edge driven upward while the other pivoted slightly downward. Such a movement fit with the collision zone geologists already suspected between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate in this region. In California's quakes, the energy is often released by one plate sliding past the other horizontally. Here, the collision drove the land upward, mountain building in action, condensed into a few terrifying minutes. Seismographs around the world had caught the quake signal, recording the time and intensity with a clarity that allowed researchers to triangulate its origin. Stations as far as Tokyo, London, and Cape Town all showed sharp arrivals, confirming the global reach of the shock. These records were invaluable for early seismology, providing a rare calibration point for estimating distances and magnitudes before the days of electronic sensors and GPS. The scientists who walked the altered shores of Yakutat Bay left with field books crammed full of sketches and measurements. They recorded the angles of fault scarps, the distribution of uplift, the locations of new reefs, and the dimensions of fresh landslides. But beyond the data, they carried the memory of a landscape that bore its wound in plain sight. The upheaval was not some ancient, buried event. It was fresh, almost raw, the scars still sharp-edged and clean. In the decades that followed, their observations would feed into a deeper understanding of how the St. Elias Mountains continue to rise, how glaciers respond to sudden tectonic shocks, and how earthquakes differ depending on the forces at work beneath the crust. And though the 1899 Yakutat Bay event never became famous outside scientific circles, it stood as a stark reminder of how quickly the Earth can change its face, lifting an entire coastline in the time it takes to draw a single, startled breath. In the days after September 10th, 1899, the people of Yakutat Bay were still stumbling through wreckage, gathering food, repairing boats, and making sense of a coastline that had changed overnight. But far beyond Alaska, across oceans and continents, the same violent shudder that had tossed prospectors into the mud had left its mark on delicate instruments in rooms thousands of miles away. At the Imperial University in Tokyo, the steady trace of the seismograph had suddenly spiked on the paper drum, the needle whipping back and forth in jagged strokes. The disturbance lasted for minutes, fading only gradually as the planet's vibrations settled. In London, the instruments at the Royal Observatory showed the same arrival, a sudden, sharp onset, followed by the long, slow tail of surface waves rolling through the crust. In Rome, the Italian seismological station registered it, too, noting the remarkable amplitude for an event whose source was half a world away. Even in Cape Town, South Africa, nearly 9,000 miles from Alaska, the quake's arrival was clear enough to be measured and logged. For the scientists reading those paper records, the Yakutat Bay earthquake quickly earned a place in a special category, a world-shaking event. That was the early seismologists' term for quakes so large that they could be detected across the entire globe, their seismic waves circling the planet like ripples in a pond. In 1899, the science of earthquake detection was still in its youth. The first true seismographs had only been in operation for a couple of decades, and the global network was sparse. But this quake, violent enough to rearrange an Alaskan coastline, had produced a signal strong enough to appear on nearly every instrument then in existence. The timing records from these stations allowed researchers to estimate the quake's location and, with some calculation, its probable magnitude. Though the modern Richter scale didn't yet exist, scientists knew they were dealing with something immense. The vertical displacement alone, over 40 feet in places, hinted at the staggering energy release. This wasn't a slip along a fault line that merely jostled two pieces of crust past each other. It was the sudden heaving of an entire block of land. Yet while the scientific community took notice, the wider world barely blinked. The remoteness of Yakutat Bay was a major reason. In 1899, Alaska was still a distant territory with no telegraph lines reaching its far corners. News traveled by ship, and those ships left infrequently. When word of the quake did reach newspapers in the lower 48, it was often buried beneath headlines about the Spanish-American War's aftermath, industrial strikes, or political disputes. To most readers, Alaska was an abstract wilderness, and the upheaval of a few glaciers and fishing camps did not carry the same urgency as a city reduced to rubble. There were no photographs in the big newspapers showing collapsed buildings or bodies in the streets, because there were none. No dramatic rescue efforts involving hundreds of volunteers, because there were only a handful of survivors to begin with, and they had rescued themselves. The quake had left no great scar on human memory because its victims were so few and its witnesses so isolated. For scientists, however, the Yakutat Bay earthquake became a valuable case study. It provided data points that would be cited in seismological journals for decades, records of wave arrivals, notes on uplift and subsidence, and observations about how such vertical displacement could occur in a collision zone like the St. Elias region. In a way, the event bridged two worlds: the old style of geological fieldwork, based on boots-on-the-ground observation, and the emerging global science of seismic monitoring, in which distant instruments could bear witness to a catastrophe without a single human eye seeing it happen. And though it never gained the public infamy of San Francisco in 1906 or Tokyo in 1923, the quake of September 1899 still shook the world, in the literal sense, reminding scientists and anyone who cared to listen that there were places on Earth where mountains could rise in a moment, and the only audience might be a few prospectors clinging to alder trees and a trembling line on a sheet of paper half a world away. The 1899 Yakutat Bay earthquake mattered for reasons that went far beyond its remote shores. In an era when most great seismic events left only scattered eyewitness accounts and rough guesses at magnitude, this one offered something rare: precise, measurable proof of how dramatically the land could move in a single moment. Scientists were able to map uplift across miles of coastline, noting changes from just a few feet to a staggering 47 feet in some places. These measurements were not guesses. They were written in the stranded bands of barnacles, the dead mussels high above the tide, and the sudden waterfalls where streams once met the sea. It was as if nature had left a ruler stuck in the landscape for them to read. Those data points, spread across such a large area, gave early seismologists an unprecedented chance to test their developing theories. By combining the field measurements with seismograph readings from Japan, Italy, England, South Africa, and beyond, they could refine the formulas for calculating a quake's size and pinpointing its origin. The Yakutat event became one of the best calibrated earthquakes of its time, a cornerstone for understanding how seismic waves traveled through the planet's crust and how to match distant instrument readings with actual ground movement. Equally groundbreaking was what the quake revealed about the relationship between earthquakes and glaciers. The surging of the Malaspina and other ice masses, the accelerated retreat of Muir Glacier, and the strange combination of advances and collapses in different parts of the ice field offered hard evidence that tectonic shocks could directly influence glacial behavior. This was no small discovery. Glaciers were often thought of as passive, slow-moving bodies, immune to anything but long-term climate change. Here, scientists saw that a few minutes of violent shaking could jolt them into action, altering their flow for years afterward. In short, the Yakutat Bay earthquake provided something every science craves: a detailed, multi-layered record of cause and effect. It showed not just that the Earth could rise dramatically in an instant, but exactly how much it rose, where it rose the most, and what else that upheaval set in motion. For a remote event with so few witnesses, it left behind an extraordinary legacy, a blueprint for understanding the forces that build mountains, reshape coastlines, and even push glaciers into sudden motion. In the days after the Great September 10th quake, the survivors lived in a state of constant tension. At night, the prospectors lashed themselves to sturdy alder trees, fearing that another massive wave might come in the dark and sweep them away. Every aftershock sent a tremor through the ground and a jolt through their nerves. Sleep came in ragged snatches, interrupted by the groan of icebergs breaking from Hubbard Glacier or the muffled roar of distant landslides. In the Tlingit village of Yakutat, families abandoned their homes near the shore and moved to a high, windswept rise they called Shivering Hill. There, they camped under the open sky, watching the horizon for any sign of another surge. The name was fitting, shivering from the chill of the September nights, and from the knowledge that the land beneath them had proven it could change without warning. For those who had seen it happen, the earthquake was more than a moment of fear. It was a revelation of nature's raw power. In a single breath, the earth had lifted entire stretches of coastline higher than a house, exposed the sea's floor to the sun, and rearranged the shape of bays and islands. It had sent glaciers crashing into the water and set the sea in motion like a living thing. The 1899 Yakutat Bay earthquake wasn't just a tremor. It was nature, in one violent instant, redrawing its own map. The prospectors, the villagers, the scientists who came later, all left with the same understanding. The ground beneath us is not fixed, not safe, not permanent.